Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar on crisis communications. I am Roy Harriman with Ministry Pacific, and we appreciate you joining us today. In this webinar, we are going to mix things up a little bit. Normally, I interview our guests, but today I am joined by Megan Neer, who is Director of Communications for an organization called Heart to Heart International, which is a healthcare nonprofit that works globally. Megan, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's go ahead and get on into our topic, Crisis Communications 101, speaking for your cause when things don't go as planned. And I'd like to formally introduce Megan Neer, who's Director of Communications for Heart to Heart International. And previous to joining Heart to Heart, Megan worked as a journalist in corporate public relations and ran her own public relations company for about 20 years. So she has a great deal of insight to offer on this topic in her own right. Megan, why don't you tell us a little bit about Heart to Heart? And I know that its mission will definitely resonate with some of our viewers here today.
Great. Okay. Like Roy said, I'm Megan Neer. I'm Director of Marketing Communications for Heart to Heart International. We're a global humanitarian nonprofit. What that means is that we work globally, but we also do a lot here in Kansas City. So I see we've got some folks from Kansas City. We're headquartered in Lenexa, Kansas. We have a program that's specific to local efforts, and then we do things all across the United States. We're most well known for our disaster response, and that's really primarily because of the news. So they love to cover us when we are responding to a hurricane or a tornado or a wildfire. That tends to get us, and it gives us something to communicate about as well. And so what we're doing, whether it's a disaster response, like a natural disaster, or if it's what we consider like in the crisis category, which would be the border crisis, what's going on, Israel-Palestinian conflict, and of course, Ukraine. And those have been huge, huge responses for us in the past 2 years now. No matter how we're responding, it's our mission to provide access to health to those who are in need.
Well, excellent. Well, I think Heart to Heart meets a need, whereas so often people feel like, well, I care about this situation, but I wish there was something I could do. And you are able actually to either getting people hands-on and or by generous giving, helping to reach out around the world. All right. Well, I'm ready to be interrogated if you're ready.
Okay. That's my cue. Sorry. You've heard about me. Let's learn a little bit about your background and how it relates to crisis communication.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And thanks again for being a part of this. Megan's background and my background are a little bit similar. In fact, she was a reporter at a daily newspaper right before I left. Our paths didn't cross, but it's like the chair was still warm when she had left. And so I worked in journalism, local journalism, for about 10 years and witnessed a lot of crises firsthand, as well as how people responded to them. And then I worked as a director of communications for two large churches for about 12 years. So I had a really excellent opportunity to be inside of organizations and learn what kind of issues that they deal with, what kind of challenges they face. Since 2015, I've led my own marketing communications company, and I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of nonprofits during that time.
Start by telling us, why do churches and nonprofits need to have a plan for crisis communication?
That is a question that I'm sure a lot of people who are joining us today have. That we didn't sign up for crisis communications. We just wanted to help people. But the issue is, if the problem happens on our watch, then we are the ones responsible for communicating about it, or at least someone on our team is responsible. Even if we hide in the closet and cut ourselves off from the world, we're still sending a message by our silence. So, like it or not, when the spotlight is on us, we're representing our faith, our organization, our cause, and the world is watching. So what we say or don't say matters. And today, news, even fake news, innuendo, travels faster than ever before because of social media, mobile communications. So if we wait several days to figure out what we want to say, the story is already basically set in cement. So we have to be flexible, we have to be fluid, we have to be ready. And communicating well in a crisis, even if we don't want to, and of course none of us want to, is really part of being a good steward of what has been entrusted to us, whether you work for a nonprofit or a ministry or both.
So next question. And I really kind of reworded this a little bit because no one out there can schedule a crisis, right? Not just churches and nonprofits, but nobody can. And so that goes back to why we have to be prepared. And if we could schedule one, I don't think any of us would be putting that on our calendar. So how can we prepare for something that hasn't?
Yeah, how can we prepare for something that hasn't happened? The first thing is that usually people don't prepare. It's a lot easier not to prepare and just let everything hit like a ton of bricks. Of course, we hope that that doesn't happen. If we don't prepare and we are confronted with something just on the fly, it can be devastating. And really it kind of puts us in a situation where like you can't unbake a cake, right? And you can't undo an image or a statement that's controversial or inappropriate that's made in response to a question when there is a crisis. The good thing is you don't have to prepare for 74 different possible outcomes. There are innumerable things that could go wrong at a church or nonprofit, but statistically, only a few of those things are likely. And so the wise thing to do is to hone in on those few and be prepared to address issues related to them. And hopefully nothing will ever happen, but if it does, you'll have a quiet sense of confidence going forward. So here's a grim example. The number one cause of litigation against churches is sexual abuse. With that in mind, for churches, prevention of abuse, just the actual act of preventing abuse, should be our number one priority. And that means also it should be one of the areas that we're most well-versed in communicating thoroughly about. Our preparation for this, in other words, planning for communication, is we want to prepare as though a journalist was coming to do an interview about how we've done such a great job protecting the children in our care and what exactly have we done to make that a reality. The fact is, however, crisis communications, it can't stand alone. So if we're standing on sand, then we can't communicate with confidence. We can communicate effectively and with confidence about, for example, child safety, because we take child safety seriously, and we can demonstrate that. But if we say we take it seriously and our actions don't match up, there are no magic words that we can say that really is going to minimize our negligence in the face of that crisis. The process of planning for something that hasn't happened is identifying key vulnerabilities for our organization. Again, there are some things that, like the top 3 risks, that are applicable to most churches and or nonprofits, but there are some things that are going to be particular to your organization. And we just have to be honest about where things are at before we can improve them. So this isn't pointing a finger at anyone. That's the start, is just being a transparent, hey, we're not where would we like to be, where are things at really?
So the idea of identifying those risks and kind of weighing which risks are pertinent or appropriate for an organization, how do you do that? And then how does that help you come up with the best response?
The good thing is it's not one person that does all of this. It's going to involve a team, and depending on how complex your organization is or how many different ministries are going on under the roof of your church, you're going to have more people involved. So for example, a typical church, you'll have children's ministry, probably have student ministry, senior adult ministry, and then you have other things that don't seem as risk related, such as worship ministry or music ministry. But all of these areas will have different potential risks or liabilities. I was reviewing my notes from when I led the church team that I served on about 10 years ago, in terms of what kind of crisis plans they have. And it was interesting. The worship ministry participated, and their most significant threat that they identified, and this sounds kind of funny, is someone falling off the stage. It does sound funny, but you have to think about it this way. First of all, it's horribly disruptive. In other words, if that happens, no one's going to remember anything else the rest of the day. But someone could be seriously injured in a very public way. Nobody wants that. So they actually created a way to keep that from happening, some warning tape and things like that. So they prevented an issue from even coming up. And that's the idea of what we want to do. We can't always be that proactive where we can say, oh, this won't happen because I put a barrier in place. But for example, sticking with the theme of children and youth, you would begin by honestly listing vulnerabilities. So like, what are our risks? Have we addressed them? Have we thoroughly addressed them? Where do we need improvement? What will we do? When will we do it? Is anyone accountable for doing it? And I can say with churches, a lot of times that last one, is anyone accountable for doing it? That falls short because we want to be nice. But at the same time, it's part of being a steward to make the most and protect what has been given us. So having multiple people involved is very helpful because people will have different perspectives and you're going to learn a lot about your organization. So to take the example of children and youth, you may learn that 80% of your volunteers have passed a background screening. Well, that sounds good, except 100% need to have passed the background screening, correct? You could find that you have someone working in youth ministry who is on the registered sex offenders list. You may have a policy of having a minimum of 2 unrelated adults in each children's classroom, but sometimes in a pinch, you go with just one. And if you find this kind of information out, then obviously alarm bells should be going off and changes need to be made. So this is more than communication. This is of course policy, but you can only communicate from a position of strength. And so when changes are made, you can reiterate your policy with confidence if a crisis arises. Everybody's too busy for this, but when we come back to imagining a microphone in our face and we're having to give an account, we'll find a way to make time.
So Roy said that I was allowed to interject things here and there. So
Please.
we didn't talk about this before, but I think what you described sounds a little overwhelming. And I know it did to my clients over the years. And so one of the things we would talk about is, as you're weighing those risks, let's prioritize and pick the top however many, 3 or 5, and start there. If you have identified 10 or 20 risks and now you need to put together responses for 20 different things, you're like, I will do that when I have an entire month to work just on that, which is never happening for any of us. So take it in a bite size. Maybe you do 3 one year, 3 the next year, and you have these responses then available to you. So, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. So next question, what are some other topics that may result in controversy?
Sure. And no, I appreciate the addendum there. Yeah. If we sit down and we come up with 20 top risks, well, first of all, something is wrong, but and no one can manage that level. So that's excellent. So the great thing about having other people involved in this process is that we become blind to threats that are right in front of us, that are hiding in plain sight. Some things that we just don't think about. One thing for every organization is a parking lot is a place of liability and risk. It's a place where all kinds of mayhem can take place. Just do some Google News alerts. Almost none of the things that happen have anything to do with a member of your organization, volunteers, staff members, or even an activity that's happening at your organization. But some things that can happen, for example, mass theft or burglary of automobiles during the worship service. Of course, no one from the congregation did it. No one from the staff is responsible, but at the same time, no one did anything to stop it when all that would be required is for someone to be, walking around in a visible manner. And that's not something that's likely to make the news, but it is a crisis for the 7 people who had their windows smashed out. And is it unreasonable for them to think that the church could have done a better job? The other thing is, if someone is assaulted in your parking lot after hours, again, this is not going to be someone from your church, or at least let's hope not. No one in the media is really going to care who was involved in this. The fact is, it happened at your church, and it's very possible that your name will be part of that news report. A simple area like having a parking lot can involve risk and liability. So that's why it's good to have all people involved, facilities teams, for example. And one thing that's been pointed out is a good way to stop after hours undesired activity in parking lots is to install a parking gate. One of the simplest approaches, and people who are looking for a place to do no good will move on to a location that's less difficult to get to. A couple other things that are, again, just basic. Does anyone ever conduct a fire drill? Does anyone know what to do, what you're supposed to do if a fire alarm goes off in the middle of a worship service? Now, this isn't likely to warrant a media story unless there actually is a fire, but I've been in a church auditorium where the alarm sounded and it was clear the pastor had no clue what he was supposed to do or say. A related risk is, does anyone on the premises know CPR? Are there any medical people in the congregation? How will we respond if someone passes out or worse? Most of these things are high-level issues that involve just basic public safety and basic protection of people. If we focus on the fundamentals of protecting people and public health, then we'll cover probably 80% of the crises that might occur.
The other one that I think people forget about is online security. And so, could somebody be stealing information from the organization, and now they have, contact information from all of your donors and supporters. And so that's one of the ones we've plugged in as a top risk here at the nonprofit I work for.
Yeah, that is excellent, because there are more people engaged in that kind of criminal activity than ever before. And usually churches and nonprofits were easy targets.
We've kind of done how to prepare and a little bit about how to weigh the different risks so that we're, again, prepared. What about communicating to the media? And are there other groups that we should think about communicating to?
The bottom line on this topic is we don't want to freelance communicate or off the cuff communicate. It just so often results in unintended statements or being misunderstood. And so the thing to do well before any sort of crisis is that we have a crisis response team. It may just be 2 people, or it could be, 3 or 4. Establishing a crisis response team and determining the functions of each team member. And again, this happens before a crisis, not during a crisis. And some of the questions you'll answer is, who will speak to the media? Who will communicate to the congregation? If there are other audiences, for example, if you run a school, then you'll be communicating to parents. The messages will not be inconsistent, but they will be a little bit different because each group will have different needs. So the thing to do, even if you have no idea what you're doing yet, is go ahead and create a crisis team and identify the people who need to be available and ready to respond. And the other issue is people outside of the team need to understand the role of the team. So if a receptionist answers the phone or anyone else answers the phone and it's the media and they have questions, they don't try to respond to the media person. They know that the crisis communication team is where to go. Another thing to do in advance is that you want to be able to contact legal counsel if necessary. You don't necessarily, it's not that every crisis is going to require legal counsel, but at 5 a.m. when the big story breaks, it's going to be too late to get a quality legal representative. You don't want to wait till you're underwater. If you already have an attorney, that's great. What I recommend is one who understands churches and nonprofits and can give you advice in a way that aligns with your mission. Because if you have essentially a business or corporate lawyer, of course, they're very skilled at it, but you could end up in a situation where basically they shut down all communication. Everything is no comment, lips are zipped, doors are locked, lights are out. And their intentions are noble, as they want to protect you from risk, but they don't understand the role that churches and nonprofits play in community. And so we cannot act like a Fortune 500 company. You may also want to establish ahead of time a relationship with someone who understands the media and works in marketing communications. Megan has been a person like that for a number of companies who can give advice in times where you have something that's difficult to communicate, or that's it is a crisis, or the time is tight. They can help in drafting a statement on your behalf. There could be a member of your church who is gifted in this area. If you do not have the means to have a professional, you can at least get training about basic media relations.
And I like that you brought up this comment about attorneys working with PR folks, because there is at times a middle ground that we can come to. They are saying, lock your doors and hide. And we're saying, let's get out in front of it. And I think that there's probably a way that that messaging can be funneled through the attorney, and so that we know that it's right on. Roy and I are not lawyers, and so we don't understand some of it, but we are always going to lean towards apologizing and some of those sorts of things, and that's where the attorneys get a little nervous. We've developed the plan, and now, unfortunately, a real crisis has happened. So can you kind of walk through what an organization should do?
The first thing is, don't waste any time. As soon as we get a whiff of a problem, and maybe there's not even been any reporting, maybe there's not yet something that's transpired, but we convene our team and we start getting facts. We want to learn what, if there's an allegation, what are the facts of it, what's really happened, as best as we can determine. Things that can happen in church and nonprofit settings, this is just a few. Someone drowns at a summer camp pool. That's a real tragedy. We've seen that reported. Embezzlement, unfortunately, happens all the time. Sexual abuse claim, again, that's the number one cause of litigation against churches. At this time, this is when we can look at, okay, is this something that realistically could result in litigation? That's when we need to engage legal counsel. As Megan said, it's not that we're going to say nothing, but it's that the content of our speech will be different. An example of something that is a crisis and there's a real danger, but it's not related to any litigation, at least towards us. So say, for example, a live power line is down on your property after a storm. You can talk about this without fear of liability. You just want the congregation, and perhaps if there's a school that meets on your property, to know that you've spoken with utility, it's being handled, but for now, don't show up today. Activities are canceled for the day. So it was a crisis, and if you didn't do anything, it would have been a real problem, but you weren't responsible for it. You were just responsible for communicating about it. If the crisis involves personnel, and many do, that's where most of the breakdowns happen. Then again, an attorney is going to be involved, because what we might want to say about a person or a situation is not necessarily what we should say. And that's for the benefit of everyone involved. If a staff member is arrested, for example, well, first of all, an arrest does not equal guilt. It indicates suspicion of guilt. We may want to say a great deal of things, but what we're usually going to be constrained to saying is that we're grieved by this event. We're fully cooperating with police. We take accusations like this seriously. We're supporting the family. We want to let the legal process play out before we speculate about charges. Now, this is a really difficult position for a church to be in, but yet it's not something that's unlikely to happen. It's all right for us to communicate to the staff member, but communicating publicly, again, we don't really know what happened until the legal process plays out. Finally, a key to communicating effectively about this is not getting thrown off course in our communication, because we're going to be emotional. If you work in the nonprofit sector, if you work in church or ministry, it's not just a job for you. Your heart's in it. The people who you work alongside are like family. And so we're going to be quite emotional, but we've got to stick to a written statement. And this statement needs to be prepared by our team. It may have the input of an attorney. It may have the input of a media relations professional, but this statement is likely all that we're going to be able to say about the incident at the time. If we are pressed to answer questions that we can't answer, then we could say we'd like to speak further about this, but we can't do it at this time. And people almost always veer into trouble when they go off the script. And so the idea is not to be evasive, but not to create even more problems. So for example, stop digging the hole deeper. So Megan, I have a couple questions for you
Okay.
related to this very, very topic. So I want to take advantage of Megan's experience dealing with media people, which she still does quite a lot in her current role. It's going to be way too brief, but when we're in a situation where we feel like we're not being treated fairly, there's a controversy in our midst, we tend to, and this is often a case among people of faith, we feel like the media is the enemy. Is that the right mentality to have going into a discussion with media people as we try to make our case?
Right. And I do hear that a lot from my clients. They're annoyed, they're irritated that they have to do this interview. And so I get the feeling that they dislike this person. They think of them as the enemy. I would first like to point out that Roy and I were both journalists and we're extremely nice people. So the one thing you have to think about is that these are professionals and they have a job to do. And they are not looking to do a gotcha story or ambush you, but they've been asked by their supervisor, probably a news director for TV or a producer, or whatever the case may be, to go and cover this story. And so they are coming in not as the enemy. So I want you to think about that. They're not always looking for the negative story either. I've spent my career pitching positive stories to the media and having really tremendous results for clients. But the one thing you do have to think about is they are on a deadline, no matter what channel you're getting a call from. They have a deadline, and you should know what that deadline is. It's perfectly appropriate to ask. They don't always know the topic. And as I work with the journalists here, mostly locally, but even nationally, they are covering stuff so fast that it's very difficult for them to become an expert on a topic. So remember that you are the expert and they probably know nothing or very little. So if you can help them, the more you can help them, the better you're establishing a relationship with them. And then I already mentioned that they're trying to do their job. So a couple of other tips I have are that the media like sources that are open and transparent, genuine, and good storytellers. So we're talking about a context of a crisis. So you may not have anything anecdotal to share, right? But the genuine and the transparent part is so important. And just like what Roy said, even responding to a question that you can't respond to by saying, I can't remember what you said exactly, but I can't comment on that right now because this matter is in litigation or a personnel matter or whatever it is. So just having the journalists hear and understand you heard them, you heard their question, but for some reason you just can't get into that specific part of it.
Put yourself in the shoes of the reporter showing up or calling in.
Yeah.
If you were them, what would you do? That's something that's hard to do, but understanding they're there to do a job, don't make it adversarial if it's not adversarial. So another question, it's that difficult area where we want to be able to comment, but we can't. And I remember seeing this story locally, a well-meaning pastor, as far as I know, a great guy. Well, he made a bad hire. It came out that someone he had hired had a criminal past, and that got a lot of press. Well, obviously devastating, devastating. And media showed up at his church, and they asked him to comment. He said no comment, turned his back, and walked to the car. And I wasn't exactly sure what he should have said at that moment, but I don't think that was the best way for him to respond. Should we ever say no comment or just turn and walk away when we're asked a question? How can we respond in those difficult settings?
We, as media trainers, always put in one of our tips, never ever say no comment. Even if you are actually not going to comment on the question, the scenario that Roy described is like worst case scenario. right? So saying no comment is just something that we see. It should just be something that we see in the movies because it's not a good response. So I said never say no comment, find a friendlier way to say it or explain why you can't or don't want to talk to the reporter or can't speak on a specific topic. And I think you can even apologize. Look, I am so sorry. I wish I could answer this question relating to X, but I'm unable to because of Y. Let them know what the why is. The no comment is the part that leaves the journalists feeling like, well, I got to have something. I have a job to do here, and this is the story I've been assigned to cover. So a lot of times they'll dig a little deeper to find something. And I think it goes back to being prepared and the messaging. Have those messages ready. And I wanted to add one more thing about everybody always wants to know, how do I specifically do this with the messaging? And so I've included some information to my clients about bridging. And this is kind of getting a little bit in the weeds, but I will tell you that if you've ever heard a politician do an interview, they are experts at bridging. So you briefly acknowledge the question, and if you can, answer positively. Some cases you won't be able to. And then you bridge back to your messaging. So the ones I highlighted are our real focus in dealing with this situation is. So I think you could use something like that if you're talking about sexual abuse and talk about your background checks and some of those other things that you do to prepare. I believe the main issue here is, we know we've heard that from politicians, and then we can't lose sight of the fact. So those bridges bring you back to your messaging, and create kind of as best you can, a friendlier, maybe even a positive image.
The bridging is excellent. And just being able, again, I think coming across as a human, you're not an automaton. Your heart's in this matter. You wish you could talk, but you can't because you need to let the legal process play out, or because you're protecting the confidentiality of employees. And you hope you'll be able to talk about it soon, but right now you can't. So that's very helpful. Megan, we're in a difficult situation. Obviously, we're already stressed because blank has happened at our organization, and there's going to be, or already is, a significant amount of public scrutiny. Donors, members are asking questions. So we're already stressed. Now we have to talk to the media, which we would have been stressed about doing anyway. How do we get through communication with the media without throwing up?
Right. This is going to be a little bit repetitive because Roy and I have already touched on some of these, but I honestly think before even the preparation starts is, who is the best spokesperson? Find that person that you know can do a nice job and will have the characteristics and the perception that you want, newspaper or TV interview. So that's key, having the right person out there in front. Is it always the pastor or the CEO or the executive director? It might not be. So then we talked about prepare, have the key messages, know you maybe you even reach into your drawer and you pull out, unfortunately, this is the exact scenario we laid out, and here's the key messages our team already developed. So you can fall right back to those. And the one thing that you should know, and maybe the team and maybe the receptionist and others should know, when a journalist calls, you are allowed, it is okay for you to say, what is the story about? What is your exact angle? And what are the sorts of things that you're going to be questioning about? They don't like to give a list of questions. So I think it's maybe even unprofessional to ask for that list of questions, but it's okay to get as much information about the interview as possible. That's going to help you feel comfortable. You are going to walk into the interview knowing what is going to be required of you. You can think through the questions, be thoughtful. Journalists are just like the rest of us, and they're probably thinking, what sort of questions do I need to ask to get to whatever? Well, we can come up with those too. Have your answers ready. Maybe you even know which reporters are coming, and you can go and do a little research about them. All of that, creating that friendly environment, super important. We've talked about clear and concise answers. If you ramble on for a long time, even if you're not digging a hole, they're going to keep asking you because they want you to say it in a clear and concise way. So get it right that first time. And I think the best way to do that is to rehearse your answers. And hopefully we don't have any chefs on the call today, but I could never get any of my restaurant clients, chefs, to rehearse. They knew what they were doing. They were perfectly capable. They didn't need to rehearse or go over anything. You might find that to be true with whoever your spokesperson is, but it's so important to your written statement is not the same as what you're going to say during an interview. You may say this, but it's not going to sound very conversational to say, we are deeply saddened to hear about, right? That's something you might have in a written statement, but you want your interview to be conversational, authentic, and so it sounds like you're actually sitting and having a conversation with that reporter. I usually tell my clients to be upbeat and smile. In the case of a controversy or a case of a crisis, I don't think that I would have to say, figure out what the mood is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, the appropriate approach to something where it would be, a crisis response.
Very helpful all around. We've got a few good questions as well. Megan, I will just address the last topic is, so Ministry Pacific, we are an insurance broker for nonprofit and faith-based organizations, about 1,200. We sponsor webinars like this to help our clients avoid and minimize risk. And so that's part of what we're doing. There is not a crisis insurance per se, but just to let you know, several types of coverage do provide funding for professional media and public relations. And this includes liability coverage, for example, for sexual misconduct, cybercrime, violent incidents, and active shooter events. You can see where some things like that will draw a great deal of attention, and it makes sense to be able to have someone on your team. So if you have those policies, that can be part of the coverage. One thing here to clarify is, if someone is accused of sexual misconduct, why would you want public relations? Well, first of all, to be accused is not the same thing as being guilty, and certainly not of being convicted. And so in that circumstance, because anybody can accuse anyone of anything, anyone can sue you for any matter, we want to be able to make our case, certainly not only in court, but in the court of public opinion. If someone is guilty, we also want to be able to communicate that this is not a reflection of who we are as an organization. We're grieved by this. We're not in any ways minimizing these actions, but we're showing compassion to the victim, and we're fully cooperating with whatever needs to be done. So we do have to be ready, no matter how prepared we feel, to respond to anything. So on the insurance side, we're happy to evaluate, to consult for free, and look at possible policies, or look at the policies you already have and see if they have coverage that helps you to be able to respond effectively in a crisis.
I might let you start on some of these answers, and then I'll jump in if you
Sure.
want. I like the question about, if your organization doesn't have anything like this in place, what are the best first steps?
Sure. So you want me to address that one? Yes. Yeah, Carolyn, thanks for the question. I think the key is to take a few examples, which unfortunately it's quite easy to do, of organizations that have faced scrutiny for something that they did or didn't do. And sometimes things just happen to organizations. Embezzlement, for example, is a very common threat that happens to churches and nonprofits. Then all kinds of things come out. Why weren't you paying attention? What happened to my money? Who's watching? Were you involved? Show some examples of things that can happen and how a reputation can be damaged, and why it's important that we have a plan to address things going ahead of time. Begin taking small steps to address the most significant risks to your organization, collect that data, and again, assemble that team. But it's better to have at least some semblance of working order than to wait till everything's perfect and start at that time.
Just to be super practical on it. That's exactly right. What we used to do back in the day when I was writing crisis comms plan, they were really thick. We'd bind them, and we just imagined when a crisis occurred, you'd like turn around and reach onto your shelf. You'd pull out this binder, and it's like step one, and we'd put the whole media list in there, which is insanity because these people quit and moved to the next job, 6 months later. So it was a completely different world. And I love how we're doing it now. It makes so much sense. I bet you can find resources that would have an outline for a scenario. So that's why I was saying take it in bite size. So maybe you have 3 scenarios. It'll tell you what you include, and they might just be 2 pages long. The team comes together and they walk through these 3 scenarios and put together a written response, even social media type of a response, and that's included in that framework. And then you can reach into a print file or go to your computer if that scenario crops up, or if one similar does. It's not going to be, every crisis is different. And so it's not going to be maybe right on, but it's going to be pretty darn close, and you can massage it, but at least there's a framework that exists.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the benefit of having a general outline of how you'll respond to crises. You may not be ready for the fact that the dumpster caught fire and burned down 3 people's cars next to it, right? But you know what you need to be able to say and what is important in a response. That's very good. Cheryl's question about where can we find more examples of bridging, is that a term commonly used in communications literature? Or Megan, did you coin that term? Did you create the whole concept?
Roy knows I did not. I do like to make up words though, so it's not at the crisis level, thank goodness. Okay, so bridging is a common term. I'm assured that there's all kinds of resources that are available online. And then I also put together my own that I told Roy he'd be welcome to share out, and I include a list of bridging in that.
Excellent thoughts. Another question was, what are some good resources on this topic? One of them is going to be the document that Megan has prepared that she's graciously agreed to share with us. So that's a great way to get started. We appreciate everybody joining us today. Cheryl has another question.
So what I would say on that, Cheryl, is this goes back a little bit to the relationship and when the reporter walks through the door. So I tell a lot of my with the exception of live TV, which we did yesterday with a client, if you feel like you misspoke about something and you're being taped, say, look, I want to do that again. That doesn't sound right to me. Or you stumbled, or you had a strange pause or whatever. Perfectly acceptable. I tell people to stop and say, let me try that again. And if you feel like I've just started down a path and you don't want to continue there, don't. Unless you're on live TV, which then you do need to bridge. Somehow get back to those key messages.
Very helpful. Someone from the media calls, it's all right to ask questions and to seek understanding about what they're working on. And also, as long as they know that they aren't being blown off, it's all right to say, I would love to talk, but I need 15 minutes.
Yep.
Or whatever a reasonable time frame is, so that you can gather some information, maybe find a resource or someone else to talk to. So it's not like there's we're not under siege. We can think, we can ask questions, and most journalists will respect our need to do that.
I tell people to never do an interview cold. If you pick up the phone and it's a reporter, no matter the topic, say, yeah, I am available. Give me a few minutes and I'll call you back. What's your deadline? Because everybody needs a minute. Like, I was working on 12 things. Now I need to do an interview on this, and take a second and think about what those key messages are.
Excellent. Yeah. Even if you do it all the time for a living, that's all you do. We still need, our brains need time to focus on a new topic. So, well, thank you. We want to be respectful to everyone's time. We always try to finish at the hour mark. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I want to thank Megan of Heart to Heart International for her moderation and insights today. Just a closing, you're never going to have spare time to develop a communication plan, and you're always going to be fixing it and making improvements on the way. So just start. That's the hardest part. But once you do, things will start working. And at Ministry Pacific, we are always here to consult about how property and liability insurance can be a part of your risk management strategy and help you make the most of the nonprofit and ministry work that you are doing. So please let us know how we can be of service. And thank you again, Megan.
Thanks for having me. This was kind of fun.
All right. And everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.